So now we are starting with chapter number 1, which is classification of the living organism. First of all, let us start with the introduction of the chapter. Now, basically in this entire chapter, what we are going to study is different type of living organisms, how to define those organisms, for their definition, what type of characteristics should be taken into account, how are they named, how are they classified. So basically anything or any aspect related to a living organism is what we are going to study in this chapter. So let us start with the introduction first. Now as we know that we are living in a nature which is full of living as well as non-living organisms. So in a nature you will find a tree, animal, human being, something like that. On the contrary, you will even find various types of things which are in a non-living aspect. So nature is full of both the things, living as well as the non-living component. If you want to study the structure and property of this components, to study the structure and property of the component, we need to study them with the help of the subject of physics and chemistry. So with the help of physics and chemistry, you can study the structure and property of various components which are there in the nature. Particularly of the non-living organisms. Now, if we see to the aspect, a particular aspect of the living as well as non-living, then it is that the property of non-living and the characteristic of living. If we see through the aspect that the property of the non-living and the characteristic of the living organism is always fixed. So when you see in the nature, when you see to the characteristics of the non-living or living organism, then they will be fixed. The characteristics of the living organism won't change. Similarly, the properties of non-living organism is also fixed and it won't change. So that is a fixed criteria for us. As we know, if we consider the property of the living organism, then the most important property of a living organism is life. Life is the basic property and the most important property for a living organism. Now, if you want to define life, what is life? And how can we say that that person is living or that thing is non-living? So for that there has to be some characteristics which decides that who particularly is living and who is non-living. So basically, to define life, it's not easy. It is not at all easy to define the characteristics of life. Particularly to understand this, to understand life, what biologists and scientists have done is various biologists and scientists has experimented it. So they carried out various types of experiments, various types of analysis which can get to know or which can draw a line between the definition for living as well as non-living organism. However, it was not at all an easy task. Finally, after lots of experiments and analysis, they came to a conclusion of giving one statement for life, and that was So basically it was that those who possess life is living. As simple as that. Whatever organisms has life in it, the one which can have the characteristic of a life in it, then that particular person is said to be living. As simple as that. Because of this, there was a question arised. Because of this, there was a big question arised that if it is simply as that those who possess life is living, then what will be the identification of those living organisms? Again, the question came to the same point, and they again started all over again. Now at this point, they started considering the aspects which can differentiate between the life and the living as well as non-living. For that is for the identification purpose, now they were considering the function. Now they were considering the function of a particular organism, how they are functioning, what are the different type of basic or adapted functions of a living organism. That was considered to be a differentiating point between a living and a non-living organism. By studying the function, you can easily understand various organisms and you can even define them. So by studying the function, it was possible to understand the organism, and it was also possible to have definition of those organisms. So at the end of lots of experiments and all, finally it was decided that they will be using the characteristic of function in order to differentiate or in order to define various living organisms in various aspects. So basically, all aspects are what we are going to study in this chapter. Now if we start with the topics, let us see what topics we are going to cover in this chapter. First is organism, and its characteristics. So we are going to define an organism, and for that we are going to consider the characteristics of the organism, and those characteristics are reproduction, metabolism, growth, development, reaction with the environment, adaptation, death, efficiency to maintain heredity, variation, organization. So these are the various characteristics of the organism on the basis of which they will be defined. Next topic is what we are going to cover is biodiversity. Next is nomenclature. That is the naming process. Then history of classification method. Then sources to study systematics. Principles of taxonomy, and finally categories of classification.